All right, Eddie, you can begin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Moral Economy. This is our 8th podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Eddie.
I'm your other host, Frat.
I'm your other host, Andrew.
And I'm your other host, Chell.
In light of what happened this past Friday evening in Paris, what everyone is, of course, talking about, we'd like to spend the next 30 seconds in remembrance of all the victims of terrorism all over the world.
Including state terrorism.
Okay, guys, so where do we begin? Obviously, there were horrible attacks in Paris just this Friday the 13th. I guess that will stick in people's minds and how bad things were on that day. And maybe we should remind our listeners that there were also attacks in Beirut the day before, in Lebanon. 40 people were killed also by ISIS.
Which there hasn't been an attack in Beirut since the 70s, so I think it's important to note.
Which goes to show the scale of the attack itself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm frankly going to say all pretty emotionally distraught,
Sure.
actually.
Yep.
Not only us, but, lots of people, not only in France, not only in Paris, but around the world. There are a lot of emotions running high right now, and I personally think it's very important for us to maybe not calm down, but to remember where we are, who we are, and to unify and stop dividing it.
Yep, and the importance of critical thoughts, and not to just act on our emotions.
That's right. I've spent the last few days basically talking about this issue with people, and especially with people who have opinions different from my own. And I would like to just start off by saying that I'm exhausted from all of these discussions, and that I'm not usually super. Issues don't usually make me very angry. I mean, I enjoy intellectual discussion mainly for the intellectual aspects of it, but this specific issue for some reason has really struck a nerve with me, and I have found myself becoming very angry with people who just make arguments that I find are dangerously close to hate speech. And these are people from the right, which maybe you would expect, but also from the left, which you maybe wouldn't expect, or at least I wouldn't expect. People that I would normally respect as very intelligent and enlightened people, and they're making these arguments, and I don't even know if they realize that they're making it, but I mean they are dangerously close to hate speech, and it is exhausting.
Yeah, I think one of these arguments, or the main argument, revolves around that there is something inherently violent in Islam, and people who are making these arguments, they're pointing at Islam. They might even be saying, it's not all Muslims, but they're pointing at Islam for being inherently violent and giving terrorists such as ISIS the ability to justify their attacks.
Indeed, and they're laying most of the blame for this violence on Islam, as though Islam is the main culprit in this whole story.
Yeah, and I think we want to remind everyone that, there's a historical perspective to all of this. It's not just Islam, just like it was never just Christianity, just like it was never just any one religion. You go into any conflict, Palestine and Israel, it's not just the Jews or the Islamic Palestinians. If you go into conflicts in Pakistan and India, it's not between the Muslims and the Hindus necessarily. These conflicts come from something else and have historical perspectives.
That's right, and even the historical perspectives, which are extremely important aside, the idea that you can somehow blame all Muslims or say that this is so inherent to Islam that somehow every Muslim has the potential to suddenly and unexpectedly radicalize or something along these lines is just ridiculous. If the people who are perpetrating these acts of terrorism, insofar as these people are Muslim, are also a very small minority of Muslims. They are an extremely radical, extremely violent minority of a large group of people in the world who most of these people are peaceful and just like everybody else.
Very large group. It's 1.59 billion
1.59 billion
in the
people.
world, second largest religion.
And in order to respond to any reaction that some of our listeners might have felt, given our introduction so far, more Muslims have been influenced by ISIS attacks than any other groups in the world.
Yeah, they're the biggest victims, right?
Yeah,
Thousands,
the biggest victim,
literally.
yeah.
Not only
Thousands.
directly attacked, but Muslims have been persecuted for ISIS attacks. Muslims have been displaced because of ISIS attacks, and now they are coming to Europe and they are facing the same problems here. They are still being persecuted.
Exactly. Suddenly we're saying the refugees might be terrorists, but the refugees are fleeing the terrorists. They're fleeing ISIS. We have a common enemy. So.
Yeah, so I mean, where do we begin? Again, this we've all talked about this before. 1 year or almost a year ago, at the beginning of this year, with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, right? That was a big question of free speech in the face of religion, and now that question isn't there anymore. This time, but a lot of the same hateful things are being said.
And I think we can also discern a very concrete development in the strategy ISIS has been employing. They have become much, much more clever in their strategic thinking, in the way they employ their resources in order to gain more recruits. I mean, they attacked Beirut right before Paris. And they it almost looks like they anticipated the reaction that is being felt all over the western part of the world right now.
I think they counted on it.
Yeah.
They counted
As a
on
calculation.
it. Yeah. And, we should see this coming too. This is exactly what happened after 9/11.
Yeah.
Exactly. If we start to blame Muslims, if we start to say that this is something intrinsic to Islam, and we start to, blame Muslims and attack Muslims and commit acts of violence against Muslims who otherwise would never have thought of supporting something as outrageous or violent as ISIS, we're going to end up marginalizing and thereby helping ISIS recruit more of these people.
Right. And the victims,
ISIS,
of course.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, sorry. And that's what ISIS expects. That's what ISIS wants. They want us to now try to turn the blame against all Muslims so that they can increase their recruitment numbers.
And it seems as if they're betting that Western societies are going to start persecuting these refugees even more. And I would suspect they're hoping that these refugees would maybe even turn towards ISIS as a response to the oppression that they're going to receive here in Europe and in the US.
It doesn't even have to be that. If they can get Europe to stop allowing refugees in, well, then those people stay in the Middle East who would otherwise have gone to Europe, and so the people that ISIS seeks to rule are then staying there, and so that's it doesn't have to be as specific as getting people to turn to ISIS. It could be just as subtle as preventing people from just fleeing ISIS.
And on the other hand, we have seen the Western response, or for that matter, any other government's response to ISIS and its affiliated powers. Many governments are still shaking hands with the Saudi Arabians, with the Turkish government. I mean, these guys have been shown time and again to support ISIS, not only financially but militarily. And we see the people who are criticizing or being feeling so many strong emotions about ISIS, seeing them as barbarians, seeing them as representative of all times. But this is not the case. This is a very complex political situation that is really hard to get a grasp of, I think.
Yeah, on the barbarian point, the New York Times reports that France has already struck ISIS targets in Syria in response to the attack. That was Saturday night, one day after the attack. And, quote, President Francois Hollande, who vowed to be, quote, unforgiving with the barbarians of the Islamic State after the carnage in Paris, decided on the airstrikes in a meeting with his national security team on Saturday, officials said. I mean, this language, barbarian,
Yeah.
right? Mm-hmm. Okay, it was barbaric what ISIS did, certainly. But this language, barbarian, is also going to be applied to Muslims, to people fleeing ISIS, to people who are either caught in those countries and can't get anywhere, or have thankfully escaped those countries and gotten to Europe, and now they're barbarians. And then we see what happens directly after the attacks, not hours after attacks. Refugee camps are set on fire.
And I think now this also goes to show that we have to think about military trade agreements as not only economic agreements, economic deals. They are far beyond it. I mean, we heard from Vijay on Democracy Now! Today that France has a $10 billion military
contract with Saudi Arabia.
And we know all what Saudi Arabia stands for when it comes to ISIS. They officially support ISIS.
It's official?
Yeah.
It's under the table?
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
Well, that's just a huge bummer, guys.
Indeed.
Indeed. I mean, we're going into. I mean, we're in dark times now, and we're going into darker times. I say, and I think maybe the biggest question we can ask right now is what do we do to get out of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's the importance of class struggle. To think about that. Yeah. Coming out of nowhere with this, but I mean, I think that's very important because the rhetoric seems to be this religious one. That's a very obvious one, and that's easy, and that's convenient for the state. That's convenient for the radicals, for the extremists, sure. And the reason we're in this kind of situation is because of global capital. It is because of the state apparatus and the money that they make destabilizing the whole Middle East region.
And much before that, too. I mean,
Syria, this area of Syria, has, if I'm not mistaken, 1/3 of the world's oil. And to have direct access, if Syria is under Western control, they have direct access to bring that oil from the Middle East across Syria to the Mediterranean, which is much cheaper than going all around Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, to talk about global capitalism, I think is very important because it is because of all of this death and carnage that we're seeing all over the Middle East and, of course, even now in Europe, obviously. And hopefully this can move a kind of discussion where we can say, okay, now we're seeing blood in Europe. Oh my God, I can't believe we're seeing blood in Europe, although it's been happening already in the Middle East because of us. Hopefully this can move us to some kind of movement where we say, okay, no more blood for oil, be it European blood or Mideast blood or Asian blood, whatever the case may be. I think it's important to link these two things, to link capital, to link the state, and to also link this terrorism that's going on as a result.
And you mentioned now class and capital and the state, and we've mentioned the historical perspective. And I think it's important that maybe we explain this historical perspective at least a little bit. Western powers, France included, England, and then later the United States, they went into the Middle East hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago. 100 years ago. They colonized it, they divided it up, and then when they realized how important oil is, they took the oil reserves for themselves. Birth of British Petroleum, for instance, comes from this area. And so this has been going on for a very, very long time, and we've been saying, or people have been saying this for a very, very long time, that not only is there injustice of us going there imperialistically and dividing them and taking their resources, also that by doing that we are setting the stage for retaliation, such as what we see in what we saw in Paris, and also what we see as ISIS right now.
Yeah, anyone else want to add more to the connection between terrorism, global capital? I mean, there's a lot to be said, but I do want to take it also somewhere else. But maybe we should continue with this topic.
I mean, what is actually terrorism? It's kind of hard to define it because there are all kinds of different things that are being labeled terrorism. In Turkey, you can be charged with terrorism for basically anything that goes against the government or the state, and I'm sure the situation can be compared to that in the one in the United States as well. I mean, just look at what's going on, what has been going on in Guantanamo. People in jail for 14 years now with no charges.
No due process.
Nothing at all. Look at this situation from the perspective of a so-called terrorist. A terrorist act is actually a means to a political end. It's a way of bringing to the common sense, bringing to everybody's attention something that has not been heard of, that people do not relate to, that has been ignored. Terrorism is mostly considered in this way, in critical perspective. And the reaction that the governments give to terrorist acts do not really aim at addressing the root cause of it. It's always exacerbating the situation.
How so? Can you please expand a bit more?
Let's look at the Paris situation. The immediate response of the French government was to bomb Raqqa. Many civilians died, and this is definitely going to be used by the terrorists, by the ISIS terrorists, as a weapon of agitation. They are going to get much more people, recruits, voluntarily, because they are going to see, yeah, look, they are still bombing the civilians.
Right. And that shows just how a military response isn't a solution, because the military response has been the response for the past, 15 years, and it hasn't done a damn thing.
And on the other hand, the government response also serves to perpetuate their domestic agendas. Now Holland has assumed a duty in order to show that Front National is not the only option. He has no other option to react, and he has to show that he can be as tough as Marine Le Pen on this. Otherwise, he's going to lose the elections.
Which are coming up, aren't
Yeah.
they?
Just to go quickly to the definition of terrorism,
According to?
Noam Chomsky always uses the definition of terrorism that is found in the U.S. Army manual, which defines it as, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature. This is done through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear. And so that is very accurate what you said. And this is the exact accepted definition of terrorism, not by Chomsky, by the U.S. Army.
That's
How
right.
about that?
And I'd like to point out, Paris's response to these attacks reveals kind of a contradiction in our thinking, or maybe the mainstream thinking about terrorism. Because you're hearing this over and over again, and I absolutely agree that what the terrorists did in Paris was unacceptable. It was unjust. That civilians should never be targeted in this way. That it's sick, and it would take a sick person to commit these acts, and a sick person to plan these acts, and a sick person to use these acts for political ends. But the response of Paris by going into Raqqa and bombing civilians, what's the difference? Okay, maybe they had some targets in mind. Maybe among those civilians there were a few terrorist leaders, but maybe not. You almost get the feeling that they just carpet bombed Raqqa. So they literally killed thousands of civilians, potentially hundreds, thousands. I don't know.
Can we get numbers on that?
Yeah, I have no numbers for Raqqa, but they went in, they bombed a city full of civilians, and they in a sense targeted civilians. So they in a sense did the exact same thing that the terrorists in Paris did, and somehow then the justifications change. You know, when you talk to many people about this issue, somehow this is okay. It's okay. Paris's response is okay. It's a response because what else could they do? They had to respond somehow, or it's a response because it's somehow self-defense. You know, but it's okay when Paris does it, when a government does it with, you know, F-16s or whatever Paris flies. But it's not. It's absolutely unacceptable when terrorists do it in Paris. But I would contend that these two acts are essentially the same. They are both terrorist acts, and they are both unacceptable. They are both disgusting, and they both deserve the strongest criticism that we can give.
I agree absolutely with Chad, and I would like to add that these acts generate, perhaps almost without exception, a false sense of urgency. It is true that something has to be done against this, but what is this thing to be done? Is it just the terrorist that is the problem, or is it the source which generates these terrorists, which makes so many people believe in committing terrorist acts? With no hard human feelings.
And, you know, you say sense of urgency after all these attacks. And I kind of always wonder, where's your sense of urgency before these attacks?
Right. Why didn't they bomb Raqqa before? If
Yeah,
ISIS was such a big threat, they bombed the Russian liner, which we forgot to mention.
And these terrorists were on the French watch list.
I mean, I'm going to say there are obviously lots of people on the right who do feel a sense of urgency and do feel like they need to bomb these people, just as ISIS obviously feels a sense of urgency for carrying out its attacks, or maybe not, because
I'm not even sure. ISIS
or maybe not because ISIS actually it can sit there and plan out these attacks. We don't know often who they are. They can just blend into the civilian population. They can just sit there and fester as we continue bombing innocent civilians. They sit there and fester. Maybe other Muslims or other people in the Middle East then are also sitting there and thinking about the bombings and thinking then also about who are the only people who did anything against the bombings, ISIS. And so, you know, when we have this sense of urgency. What we do is contribute to the problem. A problem where the other side, they can wait. They can wait for this stuff.
Yeah, and talk about how ridiculous. I mean, the sense of urgency is a really interesting point to bring up because really, I mean, we do feel a sense of urgency and we do think that something has to be done. So what are we going to do? Let's bomb them. It's like, let's not consider. Let's not, you know, I mean, how long did it take to make that decision on the part of the French government, you know?
Yeah.
Let's not learn from our history.
One day afterwards.
One day afterwards. There was hardly any debate or critical thinking about what actually is the best strategy moving forward. You know, we have to look at the aim. The aim has to be what? Less extremism, less violence, less deaths by terrorism. I mean, this is the goal, right? This is what we want. So why don't we do something internationally that might actually help us realize that goal? But it's like, no, we have this goal and we'll say that we need to defend France and we need to fight the terrorists and we need to end terrorism, we need to protect our people, so we're going to do the exact opposite thing and actually make the terrorists stronger and strengthen their positions and fight violence with more violence that will only ever breed more violence. And it's like, right. Why are you doing this? I mean, it's you know, a child could think this through better.
Yeah.
You know?
And I just want to add to the point that according to the handful of interviews that they've had with ISIS members, since it's so difficult to actually capture ISIS members alive, is that these guys have joined ISIS because their country, their land, their towns are so politically unstable that that's one of the few options they actually have. It's not fueled from religion.
In order to support their families.
In order to live, yeah. Most of them are in the mid-20s. They have a couple of kids. Although they might have hated Saddam, what they have now is much worse. And although I hate Hobbes, you know, the state of nature, he obviously has got a point here. You know, the role that the state plays, the stability that the state plays is fundamental to people's livelihoods. And because we don't have this anymore in Iraq and much of Syria, because of American and European imperialism, it's created this big problem. And so bombing is not going to be the solution because it hasn't worked for the last 15 years. And if we see it just looks like it's getting worse, I hate to admit it, it seems that Putin has a point. We have to secure, or rather allow Assad, support Assad against ISIS, and then from there go probably to a slow transition to some other kind of government. But this line that the U.S. and Europe have been toking, which is they totally don't accept Saddam because he did horrible things without a doubt, just seems to be unsustainable. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I got something to add right before Andrew says something on that point you made. The mean age of these terrorists is 27, and let us not forget where they come from. They come from mostly Iraq and Syria and the surrounding region. These guys were at the beginning of teenager years when the Iraq invasion started. These people know very close relatives who have been killed, displaced, tortured, raped, and these guys have been generated by the Western reaction.
I want to add on what Eddie was saying about Putin maybe being right. The question of how do we respond to ISIS. Before I get into that, I do want to say another quote from Chomsky, which I think is very pertinent to what we're saying right now. And he's talking about the efficacy of terrorism. He says, quote, "One is the fact that terrorism works. It doesn't fail. It works. Violence usually works. That's world history. Secondly, it is a very serious analytical error to say, as is commonly done, that terrorism is the weapon of the weak. Like other means of violence, it's primarily a weapon of the strong, overwhelmingly, in fact. It is held to be a weapon of the weak because the strong also control the doctrinal systems, and their terror doesn't count as terror. Now that's close to universal. I can't think of a historical exception. Even the worst mass murderers view the world that way. So take the Nazis. They weren't carrying out terror in occupied Europe. They were protecting the local population from the terrorism of the partisans. And like other resistance movements, there was terrorism. The Nazis were carrying out counter-terror. And so I would say, our response to ISIS, I have absolutely no idea how we should really respond to ISIS, who we should be supporting. I do say, however, the most important thing is to stop being terrorists. As Chomsky says, we're being terrorists. And we need to stop, reconsider our values, reconsider who these people are, come together, and maybe start exhibiting the values that we say we are protecting when we are carrying out strikes against ISIS, or when we are carrying out wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. We need to start actually exhibiting our values, such as love thy neighbor and do unto others as you would have done unto you. And of course, because it's France of liberté, égalité, and fraternité.
Or to quote the Quran, if you kill one person, you kill all of mankind, and if you save one person, you save all of mankind.
Yes, we have lots of values that come from religions and come from a rich human history. We're not all horrible, and we can come back and look at these values and exhibit them.
So guys, you're not for destroying ISIS?
I don't know how we can. How are we going to do that?
I mean, I'm no fan of ISIS, and
I don't think any of us are. But what's the option? I mean, let's talk real world. Like, what's the option here?
I think one of the biggest options is starting with not giving countries like Saudi Arabia $10 billion for their military.
Yeah, let's get into that. That's because Saudi Arabia supports them, and so does kind of Turkey, because Turkey is bombing the YPG, the Kurds, and they're the main force. They're the main force on the ground fighting ISIS.
YPG and Peshmerga.
Okay, but so that's step number one.
Step number one might be to sit down and unequivocally say, our invasion of Iraq is the reason that ISIS exists in the first place. If we do not sit and admit this thing to ourselves, to the rest of the world, we can't even be taken seriously, no matter what we do. Even if we decide that we do want to go after ISIS militarily, we have to understand we created them.
We could also open our borders to all refugees. We could simply say, if you are running from ISIS, then we will accept you into our country, because this is part of us taking responsibility for the part that we played in this. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say that we are solely responsible. I think that the story is very complicated and the history is complex. But nevertheless, I think a good place to also start would be to open our borders and say, refugees, come. If you're running from ISIS, if you're running from these people, and they are threatening your existence, then come to us. And maybe that means that some terrorists will slip in with them, but that is not by itself a reason to turn away thousands who are fleeing violence that we are, indirectly or directly responsible for.
Yeah, there are criminals not only among refugees but also among us.
Yeah, exactly.
These people are criminals. These people are not refugees. They go there on purpose among the refugees so that they can
infiltrate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and cover themselves.
More reason to create more refugees too.
Yeah.
Make more, abilities to get people to hide among people to go in. I forgot to mention this. Another value that we can exhibit is maybe turn the other cheek. That's sort of what I'm saying here is that maybe we shouldn't even think of responding with violence, but maybe respond in other different ways. As we heard on Democracy Now!, we can respond politically.
I would like to make maybe a naive point, but I think it's not really that complicated how to fight against ISIS. I mean, we already reiterated this point, but I think this cannot be understated. ISIS do not produce weapons. They have no such infrastructure. ISIS does not produce goods and services. They make trade deals, black market trade deals. With other governments, they sell oil to these governments. Turkey being one of the biggest receivers.
Suppliers.
Receivers of the oil.
Of oil, okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you cut the resources, how are these guys going to fund themselves?
Let's
not forget, ISIS is also part of the capitalist system. It's not outside it. They know how to play the game.
What was it that Putin said at the G20 meeting? You mentioned it earlier.
He said that we know of 40 countries which support ISIS
economically,
financially, among other means, and that there are some countries today in G20 meeting which we know of.
Turkey being one of them.
He didn't name names, but we know Turkey is part of the G20, and we know that Turkey is...
Who else? I don't know, that's why I'm asking. Who else could be one of these 40 countries?
Well, we've already said
Saudi Arabia, Turkey,
Russia.
I'm gonna say I'm gonna say probably Uzbekistan, but I think.
Well, Russia's supporting. They've been a long time supporter of Syria.
But maybe. Well, I guess not. I mean, probably. I don't know.
It's part of the Cold War legacy.
Right. It's in their interest that ISIS isn't there and that Assad has dominance over his territory. Who else? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean,
Kuwait.
I'm gonna say that maybe Putin was even exaggerating. Maybe not. But even if he was exaggerating, the whole point is that there are countries that we are supporting.
There is a very, very easy way to find out. Then one of the G20 members goes and asks Putin, who are these countries? Publish their names. Or somebody goes and asks Putin, forces Putin to answer this question. It is really that easy. If Putin doesn't have an answer...
I don't think that is easy, though.
Well, if Putin doesn't answer the question, he can provide means in which this answer can be leaked.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. It's all... Maybe.
I mean, we like to think that things are really complicated, and they are actually complicated, but in another way, they are really easy, actually. There is always an easy way to look at things. Things are really simple when we have the right angle. I don't claim to have the right angle. I'm expressing my opinion here, but I think it makes sense.
I think things are, in my mind, things are also really easy. I mean, I remember previous attacks. I think actually as the world has grown a little bit since 9/11, because after 9/11, I feel there was more. I mean, obviously it was a bigger attack, but there was more Islamophobia during that time, and less of the backlash against Islamophobia, like people like us. I mean, and I feel like this time there's actually is a rather big response by people saying we've learned mistakes from going into Iraq and going into Afghanistan, and that we can't just blame Muslims, and that we can't just start bombing and start tearing countries apart and think that's part of the solution, because as you say, it's very easy, and the easiness is part of seeing that this situation is actually much more complex than what we think is going to happen when we start bombing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well,
Is there anything we would like to add?
yeah. I guess
I mean, this discussion can go on for a long
this
time.
discussion
forever.
hopefully will go on forever, and I think I will add only that the purpose of this podcast is in order to continue these discussions like these and to start unifying and coming together and creating an environment where we can say things like Chell and I have been saying, that when we're saying that there's a historical perspective, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're supporting Islam or the terrorists. And then when we're speaking out against the terrorists, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're then also supporting the United States and what they have done. And we need avenues of discussion for this. We need to start creating sort of a countercultural revolution so that we can say these things without fear of being snooped on, without fear of our governments going in and bombing and ignoring our voices, and also obviously without fear of terrorist attacks. And that's only going to happen if we actually start the discussion.
Yep.
And I would also like to express my delight and strong support for the French people who went to protest against the racists who showed up in the streets of Paris after these attacks. I think they really need to be applauded.
Yes. Well then.
And I also really like the act of solidarity during the attacks.
Yeah.
The hashtag, excuse my French, Porte ouvert, open doors, where people needed, thank you for that, where, strangers were opening their doors to other strangers if they needed a place to stay. Although there was the fear that there were these attacks, maybe some of these people could have been potential terrorists themselves, people were still opening their doors. And I feel that same spirit, if we can continue this spirit that the French were doing during these attacks, of opening our doors, especially to the refugees who are fleeing from these attacks, from this violence. That's, I think, an intrinsic part to the solution, to a way forward.
Yeah. Open our doors.
I think that's excellent.
Okay. Well, guys,
It's a good way to end.
I guess you'll hear us next week. Hopefully, we'll have something less depressing to say. Hopefully, things will have progressed in a better direction by then.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks
Yeah,
for
comment and subscribe, even though there's no subscribe button.
Bye.
We're sick and tired of all your lies, your unwillingness to compromise. So we'll take it into our own hands. Educate ourselves and take a stand. We're gonna occupy your street, your intentional.